Mickey 17 is an okay movie that's really close to being a great movie. It creates a fascinating science fiction setting, does a great job of laying out the ways that this world works, and sets the stage for some cool ideas that almost come to fruition. Unfortunately, though, as so often is the case, some issues in the script hold it back from greatness. So let's talk about narration. Mickey 17 begins as a great example of how to do narration in film the right way. Not only are we caught up to speed about what's going on in this world, how this world works, but we're also introduced to our main character, and so much about this character is revealed to us through this narration, through the way that Robert Pattinson, who plays Mickey, reads certain lines, explains certain things to us. He comes across as cynical, but also a little bit shy, a little bit timid. And before we even see him on screen, before we have a word of dialogue, we have a very good idea of who this character is, and we already kind of root for him and feel for him. Later on in the film, though, Mickey 17 does start to find some of those classic pitfalls of film narration. It starts explaining things to us that don't need to be explained. It starts communicating information to us, concepts to us that would be better communicated through a look, or through a piece of dialogue, or through some sort of visual storytelling. Instead of providing color and enhancing the storytelling, it begins to replace the storytelling. And it quickly goes from being an artistic choice to being a narrative crutch. I'm starting with talking about narration here because I think it's a good microcosm of the issues with Mickey 17, a lot of which come from the fact that this is an adaptation of a novel, a sci-fi epic. Because of that, the film is sometimes weighed down by the sheer mass of information that it needs to communicate to the audience, not just what's going on in this world, but also what's going on in the character's head. And don't get me wrong, I had some fun with this movie. There's some great set pieces. It's got the sardonic sort of humor that you'll recognize if you've seen something like Parasite. It's got a lot of really cool sci-fi world building. I found the world and this ship that a lot of the film takes place in to be very immersive, and it's a world that I would not mind spending a little bit more time in and learning more about. There's also an amazing performance here by Robert Pattinson, who really surprised me because he is needing to play two versions of himself while making them feel like totally distinct characters. There's also a lot of great commentary here about the way that our society commodifies life and death and pain and suffering, which I thought was interesting, if in need of a little bit more time to develop fully. It's got some great worms in it. It's got some great lovable alien worms, and who doesn't love a lovable, slimy insect? But unfortunately, despite all the good that's in here, I couldn't escape feeling weighed down by the source material, feeling weighed down by the fact that there's so much stuffed into this movie and nothing really has any time to breathe. So let's start there. Let's start with the lack of breathing room going on here. Adapting books is hard, especially when it's to film, and especially when it's science fiction or fantasy. There is so much world building that needs to get in there. There's so much you need to catch your audience up to speed on. One of the reasons why I love movies as opposed to other mediums, other forms of storytelling, is that you have to be really efficient with a movie. You have 2 hours, 2.5 hours, however long to get this story across. You just don't have the real estate, the time to work with that you might in a novel or a video game or even a play or a musical, a live musical. And so what that requires is a very efficient sort of storytelling. You have to really be clever and creative about the ways that you get information to the audience. A film doesn't have the luxury of hundreds of pages to build a world. And I'm not saying that it's impossible to adapt a dense piece of fiction, a dense piece of science fiction fantasy into a movie. We've, of course, seen that done very well. But I want to acknowledge off the top here that it's hard. It's fucking hard. But before I get into what I feel like went wrong here, let's first talk about the plot so that you know what I'm talking about here. And so ensues my favorite part of making all of these videos, which is trying to do a plot synopsis for you. I hate it. Let's hope we get through it. without too much pain this time. Mickey 17 takes place on a spaceship that is on the way to an uninhabited planet called Niflheim. The ship is full of would-be colonists who are there to settle a new human colony on the planet. This expedition is led by Kenneth Marshall and his wife Ilfa, played by Mark Ruffalo and Toni Collette. Mark Ruffalo is clearly playing a pretty transparent Trump stand-in, so of course he is cruel and exorbitantly wealthy. And his wife Ilfa is pretty much the same. We'll get into some problems I have with her as a character later, but that's fine. Of course, also on this ship is a man named Mickey, who is what's called an expendable. So expendables in this universe are basically people where anytime they die, they are reprinted from a machine. There's this machine that has their genetic material in it, and it literally reprints another copy of the same person. Expendables basically function in this society as test dummies, essentially. So for example, you find a new planet, you're not sure if you can breathe the atmosphere, throw an expendable down there, see what happens to him, see if he dies, and then take his body back up, study it, print him out, do it again. And so we see Mickey being used just like that. He actually is sent down to the planet to test to see if the planet is habitable. It turns out it is very much not for humans. They end up printing him and sort of basically killing him and printing him over and over again as they develop a vaccine that will allow everybody to breathe the air on this planet. But the plot really begins to kick in when Mickey basically doesn't die when he's supposed to. He goes missing during an expedition, the ship loses contact with him, and they assume that he's dead. So they print out another Mickey, not realizing that Mickey 17 did not die and makes his way back to the ship. And now we have 2 copies of Mickey. And the film does a really great job of explaining to us why this is a problem. It's basically a major taboo. It's against the law to have 2 separate copies of an expendable out there. And it's complicated, there's some history about it, and that's why I think the film does a really good job of explaining that. And in general, this first half of the movie is very successful. I thought it did a great job of getting us into this world. There is actually some kind of masterful exposition going on at the beginning of the film. There are not these like on-the-nose sorts of conversations where the film is just telling us what's happening. It's really showing us a history in snippets that I think work really well. And again, the first half of this movie, the narration is great. It's all done very, very well. But in the second half of the movie, to go back to the plot for a second, the second half of the movie takes a pretty big turn into a totally different sort of narrative development that really doesn't have anything to do with Expendables or Mickey 17 or any of that stuff. On this planet, they discover this race of lovable, cute, chunky little worm aliens.
So they find another earthworm, kind of glue themselves together.
And of course, because the evil wealthy people are evil and wealthy, they want to basically exterminate these people. And so there's this conflict that ensues between these lovable worms and the humans. And again, totally on board for both of these plots. The problem is this shift is very abrupt, and I didn't feel like this particular part of the plot was allowed enough development, enough time and space to really be fully formed and satisfying by the end. So in short, my issues with the film, as maybe you picked up on as I was going through the plot, is that there needed to be more editing in the writing process, a lot more editing. There are narrative threads here that just are not given enough time and space to grow into something, to coalesce into something coherent. And I think that's a shame because there's a lot of things that are set up in this film that are really interesting, but we have so many digressions in so many different directions that it really slows down the pacing. Pacing is a huge issue in this film. For example, we have a very long narrative digression, I guess, that I think literally it felt like it took like a good half an hour of the runtime where there's basically just sort of a love triangle, or maybe it probably would be more accurate to call it a love square. Square, which is as far as I'm going to go there explaining that. You'll understand if you see the film. And this love triangle, love square sort of situation is really totally unrelated to anything else going on in the plot, and on so much time is given to it that it just brings the entire story to a halt. And I think the film realizes that too, because once this is over, the film just totally drops it and never mentions it ever again. These relationships, the tension between these characters is literally never brought up a single time afterwards, I don't think. And while it was amusing on its face for a little bit, it was unnecessary, and it's one of many things in this film that could have been cut for the benefit of the rest of the film, to allow other plot points to be developed a little bit further. And it's a shame because there's some pretty great commentary that's being laid out here that is very much in line with the sorts of films that we are familiar with from Bong Joon-ho, that very much fits within what he was doing in Parasite, and that I found really interesting. I just wish that that part of the storytelling here had more room to breathe and had more attention given to it. In terms of performances, like I said, I loved Robert Pattinson here. This is him like I have never seen him before. He's doing a totally different vocal affect from anything he's ever done. And again, he's playing these two versions of himself, which obviously we've seen before. You know, we've seen The Nutty Professor, and we've seen, I don't know, I think of Parent Trap for some reason with Lindsay Lohan. But he really has to make them two very distinct characters, and they are on screen together most of the film. They actually have a relationship with each other that has a really interesting arc throughout the film, and that is an incredible feat to pull off for an actor. Mickey 18, we learn, is much more cynical, much less patient with people, much less empathetic. He's prone to kind of violent outbursts and he's very unforgiving. Whereas Mickey 17 is kind of naive, he's kind of shy and timid, and very optimistic. And the film also, I think, does a great job of explaining why these two characters are different, why it makes sense that they have these totally different personalities, which I thought was fascinating. Another example of the great storytelling that is lurking under the surface here. Everyone else in the film does their job well. We've got a lot of supporting characters here who do a great job of bringing this larger community on the ship to life, and they all do great. But I do want to talk in a little bit more detail about Mark Ruffalo and Toni Collette and their characters. These two, I just wasn't always on board with what they were doing. Bong Joon-ho is clearly directing them to kind of ham it up, to have a lot of fun with it. They are very over the top, they're very campy, but sometimes it just went a little too far in that direction and sort of stretched believability for me. For whatever reason, I think Mark Ruffalo's performance stuck with me and connected with me a little bit better than Toni Collette's. I think mostly because he's so clearly drawing from a figure that we're all familiar with, and so his motivations, his pathetically fragile ego, and his desperate need for everyone to see him as this hero and for everyone's approval and all of that is immediately recognizable to us. Whereas Toni Collette's character is just kind of cartoonishly evil for the sake of it. She doesn't really have any motivations that make any sense or that we can recognize in the real world. She just really does feel like a caricature in some ways. I do think that this is a little bit more of a directing issue than it is an acting issue. This is clearly a tone that the film was going for that for me just didn't always connect, and sometimes there was a tension between the very real stuff that was happening and this goofy over-the-top humor from especially Toni Collette, but Toni Collette and Mark Ruffalo. It's not a huge issue, I didn't hate them, but there were moments where I know we were supposed to be laughing and I just kind of was waiting for the scene to end or groaning a little bit. So like I said, Mickey 17 is trying to say a lot of really cool things here, a lot of really interesting things. For example, because Mickey is an expendable and everybody on the ship knows that he's expendable, we see characters in the film repeatedly treating his pain and his suffering as irrelevant, as something that is meant to just be ignored, that doesn't matter to Mickey, that doesn't matter at all, because we know that he's just going to be printed out again. So what does pain matter if you're just going to be alive again, that when you're basically immortal? And repeatedly throughout the film, characters will ask Mickey what it feels like to die. This is something the film goes out of its way to have happen many different times for many different characters. And Mickey never answers it. And is always, you can always see some pain in his eyes at being asked that question so flippantly with no regard for the trauma and the emotional pain and suffering that he goes through when he dies. This had me thinking of, that old cliche that maybe we've seen in real life, but we do see in film a lot, of veterans, and the way that veterans and first responders will have people ask them questions like, have you ever killed anyone? Or, things like that, where the person is not at all thinking about the emotions behind that, the trauma behind that. And I think Expendables, the idea of Expendables in general, really does have a lot to say about the way that we treat soldiers, the way that we treat veterans in especially American society, I think. And in a very real way, when it comes to war and combat, we commodify the lives of our armed forces. We commodify life and death. And we talk about body counts, right? That's how we kind of measure who's winning and who's losing. And it almost feels like we're talking about the stock market or something like that. But what we're talking about is human life, and we are so detached from it that we don't think about what they're going through, the pain they're going through. My favorite thing about the film is the differences between Mickey 17 and Mickey 18 and how the film explains that difference. Mickey 17 suddenly realizes that his life actually does have value, that instead of just taking it for granted that he can just keep dying and he'll just keep coming back and devaluing his own life and seeing it as meaningless, he suddenly realizes, like, oh, I can actually fight for this. I can actually stay alive. And it makes sense to me that that would change your personality, right? If you thought that your life was meaningless and had no value whatsoever, and then suddenly you learn that it does, that it is something to cherish and to fight for and to protect, it would make you more empathetic, right? Because if your life has value, then so does everybody else's. But if your life is expendable, maybe so is everybody else's too. And that's what we see in Mickey 18. Mickey 18 sees himself as just another copy in the line of Mickey's. We see him much more carelessly throwing life away. We see him being much more violent, being much less understanding and empathetic in general. And there's this really kind of heartbreaking moment between 17 and 18 where 18 is like, well, we should just kill you. It doesn't matter. You're just going to be printed out. And Mickey explains that, like, well, no, now I'm me. Now I'm 17. I'm now realizing that I'm unique. And when I'm gone, it'll be just you. It won't be me printed out. It'll be you. This will be the end. And it's this great understanding of, like, the value of his own life. And again, it would be so nice if the film was given a little bit more time to explore that. I think that has the potential to be really powerful. It could have been a much larger focus of the film at the end of the day. Like I said, though, unfortunately, the climax of this film and the big kind of combat set piece at the end doesn't have a whole lot to do with those themes I just mentioned. There's a little bit in there, which I'll talk about, but it really turns into this thing that is about this indigenous alien population. It becomes very much like James Cameron's Avatar, one of these stories about a colonizing force, humans coming in, and an innocent indigenous force trying to resist them. And in this case, I keep calling them the lovable worms. But this shift happens so abruptly that when that particular conflict is resolved, it's not as satisfying as it could have been. It's not given enough time and space. I've been saying that a lot, but that's really my thesis of this video and my thesis of this review is that this film doesn't have enough room to breathe for all the various directions it wants to go to be successful and to flourish. And this is just one of those things. It feels like it comes on very abruptly. It becomes the central conflict of the entire film, but that conflict doesn't even show up until about an hour into the runtime. And I think I can see what at least the source material was going for here, because these lovable, cute, slimy worms value life in a very different way from humans, or at least from the humans in the film. They come and confront the humans in huge numbers over the lives of one or two of their own. And it becomes the most important thing to them. They drop everything, they put all of their lives at risk for the sake of one or two. Meanwhile, humanity is throwing lives away over and over again throughout. Like I said, though, there's just not enough time to really make that connection, to really draw that thread through these different narrative pathways. So I'm assuming that's what the source material was going for, but I didn't really get that in the film. And so the last section of this movie kind of feels like a non sequitur. It kind of feels like, where did this come from? Why are we suddenly in this giant war between different species all of a sudden, when that has not been what anything else in this movie is about. Now, to return to my issues with narration, because like I said, I think it's a great microcosm for everything else going on here. The weakest points in this film are a few pieces of narration that happen right at the end. So first, there's this sort of epilogue where it's being explained to the audience what happens after this big conflict is resolved, how this group of human beings gets things back together and reforms their society. And it's all being told through voiceover. Mickey is walking us through a pretty lengthy chain of events in a very short period of time, and we cut ahead in time quite a bit. And what's lost in there for me is a lot of really cool, satisfying character moments that are just spoken to us. That instead of seeing these characters succeed and seeing what they do to get to their new positions once we skip in time, we have it told to us by a narrator, which is just not nearly as satisfying to me. And even worse, we have Mickey just inexplicably explaining to us the fact that he loves Nasha, who is his love interest throughout the film, going through this montage of memories with her and explaining to us that like, oh, actually, I love her. And it was this moment for me of like, yeah, I know. I didn't need that explained to me. Which is, again, everything that's wrong with film narration in a nutshell. And I think the reason we get this sort of half-baked narration towards the end of the film is because they realized that they were running out of time and they had to pack so much information into this film because they're working from a source material that is very dense. And a classic mistake to make when you're adapting a big, dense book is this attempt to stick so closely to that source material. And I think this is just a big mistake. That's why you get these pacing issues. That's why you get all this narration that is trying to condense all of this information that maybe could have been cut, or that you're having to condense because you spent so much time on that love triangle earlier, or because you had to fit in all of these other subplots that just weren't necessary. And unfortunately, in a movie, you can't have everything that you want in it. You have to make really difficult decisions, and you have to be ruthless when you're editing it. You have to really think about like what's necessary, what is absolutely necessary to tell this story, and what just isn't adding anything, even though it's a fun moment, like that love triangle was fun. There's some comedy there, there's some laughs there, but it wasn't necessary. And if you took it out, that leaves you all this time to actually let some of these things in this epilogue play out rather than condensing it down into a montage with some narration over it. So yeah, I enjoyed a lot about Mickey 17. I think there's a lot of humor here. There's some great performances. If you're able to see it in a big screen, like I was able to see it in IMAX, I think it's worth your time. There's some great set pieces. There's some great character moments. It's a fun time. Like, I would recommend seeing it. But if you're looking for the next Dune, or even if you're looking for the next Parasite, you're probably going to be let down here. Don't go in expecting something revelatory or to the level of recent things we've seen in these genres, and just go in expecting a romp, because that's basically what it is. It's hard not to be a little bit disappointed that this just didn't quite reach the level of greatness, the potential that is clearly there. It's clearly right under the surface, and that's just kind of a bummer, but still worth seeing. Thank you for listening to me talk for a little bit, and someday I'm going to figure out how to end videos. Bye.
Kind of glue themselves together, pass each other sperm, and then when they've broken off, they then each produce a cocoon.